Imagine a day where you wake up calmly, without any rush, feeling at peace. But as the day goes on, the demands, expectations, and opinions of others start to creep into your mind. Before you know it, you begin to give in, to adjust, to negotiate that happiness that felt so completely yours when you woke up. Sound familiar? Today, we're going to explore how, through Buddhist wisdom, you can make your happiness non-negotiable, something that no and nothing can take away. Stay with us to discover how to protect the most precious thing you have, your inner peace. Chapter 1. The importance of inner peace. To understand why our happiness must be non-negotiable, we first need to grasp what it truly means to have inner peace. From a Buddhist perspective, inner peace isn't just a fleeting feeling of calm. It's a deep state of tranquility that arises when our mind is balanced, free from the desires, distractions, and attachments that lead to suffering. This peace is the core of true happiness, a happiness that doesn't depend on external circumstances or the approval of others. Imagine a lamp shining in a dark room. That lamp is your inner peace, and its light is constant and warm. However, every time we allow external opinions or our own insecurities to take over our mind, it's as if someone is placing a veil or curtain in front of that lamp. Gradually, the light grows dimmer, and our inner space darkens. That darkness is what we feel when we let external influences take over, and what we need is to learn how to keep that space illuminated, to protect that peace at the center of our mind. The Buddha taught that true happiness comes from freeing ourselves from the desires and expectations that bind us to suffering. In his discourse on the Four Noble Truths, Buddha explained that suffering is an inevitable part of life, but he also made it clear that the cause of this suffering isn't the circumstances themselves, but rather our relationship with them, how we allow those circumstances to impact our mental peace. When we understand this, we realize that protecting our inner peace is our responsibility and ultimately the key to lasting happiness. To cultivate this inner peace, it's essential to develop the ability to observe our emotions and thoughts without letting them carry us away. The practice of mindfulness, which also has roots in Buddhism, invites us to be present in each moment, to see reality as it is without judging or resisting it. By practicing mindfulness, we learn to observe how certain thoughts or feelings disrupt our peace, how our own expectations and desires, or those of others, create waves of unrest in our minds. To illustrate this, imagine your mind as a calm lake. When you allow the words, criticisms, or demands of others to affect your state, it's as if a stone has been thrown into that lake. Waves form, and the water's clarity becomes clouded. But if you decide to protect that lake, if you choose not to allow anything external to disturb its surface, the water remains calm and clear, reflecting sunlight purely. This is the mind at peace, a mind unaffected by external factors, staying in a state of calm and clarity. Maintaining inner peace isn't a selfish act. On the contrary, it's an act of responsibility. When we have peace within, we radiate calm and stability to those around us. We become people who inspire serenity rather than anxiety. Those around us, without realizing it, also benefit from our stability, from our ability to remain unaffected by external storms. In Buddhism, this is called upekkha, or equanimity. Equanimity is the ability to stay calm amidst chaos, to not let either pleasure or pain sweep us away. It's a quality that we can all develop, and that helps us see life with greater clarity and compassion. Additionally, inner peace allows us to connect with our true nature, with the essence of who we are, beyond what others may think or the labels that society imposes on us. This connection with oneself is fundamental to living an authentic and fulfilling life. When we are at peace, we can act from our essence, from what we truly are and desire, rather than from a place of insecurity or need for acceptance. This is what Buddhism teaches us. That true happiness, the kind that doesn't shatter or fade, arises when we live in coherence with our essence, without letting anyone or anything alter it. Finally, to cultivate this inner peace and make our happiness non-negotiable, we need to be mindful of what we allow into our mind. Just as we care for our body by feeding it healthy food, we must be selective about what we let into our mind. What thoughts are we feeding? What emotions are we allowing to stay? Rather than letting negative thoughts, doubts, or insecurities contaminate our inner space, we can choose to nourish ourselves with thoughts that strengthen our peace, with practices of gratitude and compassion that elevate us. Every choice we make, every time we decide not to get caught up in negative thoughts or emotions, we are cultivating that inner peace. In summary, inner peace is the foundation of our happiness, and protecting it is an act of self-love and responsibility. By understanding and applying these principles, we can begin to see happiness as something non-negotiable, something that doesn't depend on what happens outside or on what others think of us. As we cultivate that peace and learn to observe our emotions without judging or being swept away by them, we become stronger, more stable, and our happiness turns into something solid and deep, something that truly belongs to us. Chapter 2. Identifying the sources of suffering. Once we understand the importance of inner peace, the next step is to identify what elements in our lives are undermining that peace, and therefore our happiness. From a Buddhist perspective, suffering isn't simply physical or emotional pain. It encompasses anything that generates restlessness, dissatisfaction, or anxiety. To protect our happiness and make it non-negotiable, we need to recognize the sources of suffering that we allow into our minds and hearts. The Buddha taught that suffering mainly arises from three roots: desire, hatred, and ignorance, known as the three poisons. These poisons cloud our minds, and when we don't identify them, they lead us into behaviors that compromise our peace. Desire isn't only about wanting material things. It also refers to attachment to outcomes and the expectations we have about how things should be. When we live with rigid expectations, every time something doesn't go as we planned, we feel that something is missing, and this sense of lack leads us to suffer. A common example is when we rely on others' approval to feel happy. If we base our self-worth on what others think of us, every criticism, every negative comment, or even an indifferent gesture becomes a source of suffering. We feel vulnerable, as if our happiness were in other people's hands. But when we identify this need for approval as a source of suffering, we can begin to question it and work on our emotional independence. We can ask ourselves, why do I feel the need for others' approval to be happy? What's preventing me from feeling whole on my own? Another major source of suffering is hatred or aversion, which manifests as rejection toward people, situations, or even parts of ourselves. Every time we feel hatred or rejection, our mind fills with tension and resentment, stealing our peace. Sometimes, hatred arises as an automatic response to situations we don't understand or that make us uncomfortable. For example, if someone at work receives more recognition than we do, it's easy to fall into resentment and comparison, creating unnecessary suffering. But if we identify this reaction, if we observe how hatred or envy manifests in our mind, we can begin to free ourselves from its control. Instead of viewing others as threats, we can see them as opportunities for reflection and growth. The third root of suffering is ignorance, the inability to see reality as it is. Often, suffering arises because we cling to illusions, ideas, or concepts that pull us away from the true nature of things. For instance, we might believe that if we have a bigger house, a better job, or an ideal relationship, we'll be happy forever. However, this is an illusory view, as everything in life is impermanent and constantly changing. Buddhism teaches us to see reality clearly, to accept that nothing is permanent, and that happiness doesn't depend on external conditions, but on how we choose to respond to those conditions. Identifying sources of suffering also means observing behavioral patterns and relationships that affect our inner peace. Ask yourself, what situations or people create the most stress and anxiety in your life? Are certain commitments, expectations, or interactions undermining your happiness? Sometimes we live trapped in relationships or environments that drain us emotionally, and we feel powerless to change them. However, Buddhism invites us to take responsibility for our well-being, to recognize that we can establish healthy boundaries and distance ourselves from situations or people that constantly bring suffering into our lives. For example, imagine you have a friend who constantly criticizes your decisions, who judges your achievements or your mistakes. That constant criticism can slowly erode your self-esteem and tranquility. Identifying this relationship as a source of suffering doesn't mean you should immediately cut all ties, but it does mean you need to be aware of how that interaction affects your peace. From this awareness, you can make choices that protect your happiness, such as setting clear boundaries or, if necessary, creating some distance. By identifying sources of suffering, we also uncover the roots of our unhappiness within our own minds. How often are we our own worst critics? How often do we let our own doubts and fears pull us into discouragement? One of Buddhism's deepest teachings is that often we ourselves generate our suffering by not clearly observing our own thoughts. If we can identify these patterns, if we can see that our expectations, attachments, and rejections are the sources of our pain, we can begin to dismantle that suffering at its root. Lastly, it's important to remember that the purpose of identifying sources of suffering isn't to blame ourselves or feel bad about them, but to understand them in order to transform them. Buddhist practice invites us to observe our thoughts and emotions with compassion, without judgment. By doing this, we develop a greater understanding of ourselves and take a step closer to inner peace. It's not about eliminating suffering entirely, as it's part of the human experience, but about reducing its impact on our lives by observing it with clarity and wisdom. In summary, identifying the sources of suffering is an act of self-understanding and self-love. It allows us to see clearly what's affecting our inner peace and gives us the power to make choices that protect our happiness. By observing our reactions, expectations, and attachments, we can begin to build a life where our happiness is truly non-negotiable, a life where we don't allow anything or anyone, not even ourselves, to compromise our peace. Chapter 3. Practicing detachment from approval. Now that we've identified the sources of suffering and understood the importance of inner peace, it's time to address one of the most common obstacles to authentic happiness, the need for external approval. From a Buddhist perspective, detachment is a fundamental practice to free the mind from attachments that cause suffering. Among these attachments, the constant search for validation is one of the hardest to break, as it is often unconscious and deeply rooted within us. Why do we seek approval? From childhood, we learn to connect with others through acceptance and validation. We feel safe when others recognize us, and we experience discomfort or anxiety when we are rejected or criticized. This behavior is natural, but when we take this need for approval to the extreme, we begin to compromise our happiness for the sake of external acceptance. We become dependent on what others think, and without realizing it, we hand over our power and inner peace to others. Detachment from approval means recognizing that our worth and happiness do not depend on what others think. This is a core teaching in Buddhism. True peace and happiness are internal and should not fluctuate according to external circumstances or others' opinions. But putting this into practice isn't easy, especially in a society that constantly pushes us to compare ourselves, to demonstrate our achievements, and to seek validation in social media, in work, in relationships, and in so many aspects of daily life. To begin practicing detachment from approval, the first step is to become aware of when and why we seek others' validation. Observe your thoughts and emotions in situations where you feel anxious or insecure. Ask yourself, why do I need this person's approval of my decision? What fear lies beneath this desire to be accepted? Often, behind this need for approval lies the fear of loneliness, rejection, or failure. However, when we understand that our inner peace is our responsibility, we realize that we can face these fears without depending on external approval. A practical tool to cultivate detachment is self-compassion meditation. Sitting in silence and reflecting on your fears and need for validation allows you to remind yourself that you are enough as you are, that you don't need others' acceptance to be valuable. This type of meditation helps us develop greater self-confidence and allows us to see that we are capable of creating our own well-being without depending on external factors. It helps us understand that our worth isn't measured by others' opinions, but by the relationship we have with ourselves. Along with self-compassion, Buddhism teaches us to practice equanimity, a quality that helps us maintain emotional calm and stability in the face of life's ups and downs. Equanimity allows us to observe both praise and criticism with a calm mind, without being swept up by either euphoria or discouragement. When someone criticizes us, instead of reacting immediately or feeling hurt, we can take a moment to observe how that criticism affects us and reflect on whether it truly defines who we are. Similarly, when we receive praise, we can enjoy it without letting it make us feel superior or dependent on it. Putting detachment from approval into practice also means learning to say no without guilt. Many times we accept commitments or responsibilities that we don't want simply to avoid disappointing others or to earn their appreciation. But every time we say yes to something we really want to refuse, we are negotiating our peace and happiness. Practicing detachment means being honest with ourselves and others, saying no when necessary, and trusting that our value doesn't depend on meeting others' expectations. Another important aspect is self-forgiveness. When we don't receive the approval we hope for, we often become our own worst critics. We punish ourselves internally, reproach ourselves, or feel shame. But Buddhist practice invites us to let go of self-criticism and to treat ourselves with kindness. If at any point we feel that our need for approval has led us to act against our values, we can recognize it, learn from the experience, and forgive ourselves. Accepting our imperfections and seeing ourselves with compassion is key to freeing ourselves from emotional dependency. Ultimately, detachment from approval doesn't mean becoming indifferent or no longer valuing others. It means that, while we enjoy relationships and recognition, we don't let them determine our happiness. This gives us an inner freedom that allows us to act from a place of authenticity without fear of rejection or criticism. Buddhist wisdom reminds us that we are responsible for our inner peace and that no one else can give us the happiness we seek. That happiness is a right and a choice we must protect with conviction. By practicing detachment from approval, we cultivate a life where our happiness is truly non-negotiable, a life where our actions emerge from our own purpose, not from others' expectations. We become freer, more authentic, and ultimately happier. This is the true wealth that Buddhism invites us to discover. a deep happiness that doesn't depend on anything external and that remains intact, even amid challenges. Chapter 4. Establishing healthy boundaries. Once we've worked on detachment from approval and identified the sources of suffering, it's essential to learn how to establish healthy boundaries. In Buddhism, self-respect is a cornerstone for building a life of peace. Setting boundaries isn't an act of selfishness or rejection toward others. Rather, it's an act of self-love and respect for our inner peace, allowing us to protect our happiness from negative influences or situations that don't serve us. In our daily lives, we often feel that saying yes to others is an obligation. We say yes to commitments that overwhelm us, to responsibilities we don't desire, or to relationships that don't bring us tranquility, simply to avoid conflict or to feel useful. But in doing so, we deplete our energy and our peace. Genuine happiness requires that we care for our energy and know when and how to set clear boundaries. By doing this, we prevent external demands from overwhelming our peace. Healthy boundaries not only protect our happiness, but also improve our relationships. When we establish boundaries with clarity, the people around us know what to expect and how far they can go. This doesn't mean we're harsh or inflexible. Rather, it means that we communicate our needs and priorities with honesty and respect. In doing so, we allow others to respect their own boundaries too, fostering more balanced and authentic relationships. To start setting healthy boundaries, it's essential to reflect on which situations or people cause us discomfort or rob us of peace. There may be people who constantly criticize our decisions or commitments we take on just to avoid disappointing others. Identifying these areas gives us the clarity needed to begin protecting our happiness. Ask yourself, when was the last time you felt you were sacrificing your peace to fulfill something you didn't truly want to do? Reflecting on these moments can provide insights into where you need to set boundaries. Often, establishing boundaries means learning to say no. This simple word, however, can be difficult to say when we fear hurting others or feel we're failing. In Buddhism, the practice of compassion includes being compassionate toward ourselves. This means that saying no when we need to protect our peace is not an act of selfishness, but of self-care. We can learn to say no kindly and respectfully, expressing our reasons clearly and without guilt. Remember, each time you say no to something you don't want, you're saying yes to your inner peace and happiness. Additionally, Buddhism teaches us the importance of right intention, a concept from the Noble Eightfold Path. Right intention refers to acting from a place of compassion and sincerity, both toward ourselves and others. When we set boundaries, we should do so with right intention, not with the goal of distancing ourselves from others or placing our needs above theirs, but with the desire to care for our own peace while respecting others' peace. Acting with this intention, our boundaries become an expression of love and respect, rather than a barrier separating us from others. Another important aspect when setting boundaries is recognizing that, just like us, everyone has their own needs and expectations. Sometimes when we establish a boundary, others may not understand it or may even resist it. In these cases, it's essential to remember that we are acting for our inner peace and that, even if we can't please everyone, our decisions are valid. Practicing equanimity helps us stay firm and at peace, even when facing others' discomfort or disagreement. Setting healthy boundaries also involves being aware of our own limitations. We can't be available for everyone all the time, nor can we fulfill every demand without it affecting our emotional health. Recognizing our limitations and setting boundaries based on them is a sign of respect toward ourselves. This helps us avoid burnout and maintain balance in our lives. Remember that protecting your energy is an act of responsibility, as only when we are peaceful and balanced can we offer our best to others. Finally, establishing healthy boundaries is a process that strengthens with practice. Initially, it may feel challenging or uncomfortable, especially if we aren't used to doing it. However, each time we set a clear boundary, we're paving the way to a more authentic and fulfilling life. The benefits are immense. We feel more confident, more at peace, and more capable of living according to our values and desires. In summary, healthy boundaries are essential for a non-negotiable happiness. They help us maintain our inner peace, respect our energy, and build relationships based on respect and authenticity. By learning to say no without guilt and setting our priorities, we protect our happiness and create a life in which our decisions reflect our values and desire to live in peace. Remember that, ultimately, only you can decide what deserves your time, energy, and tranquility. Making your happiness non-negotiable is an act of self-love that will transform not only your life, but also how you relate to the world. Remember, establishing healthy boundaries is a journey, a process of self-love and respect for our inner peace. If this reflection has provided value and inspired you to protect your happiness, subscribe to the channel to continue learning how to build a fuller, more peaceful life together. We'd love to hear from you, so leave your comments and share your experience with healthy boundaries in your life. Share this video with those you feel could also benefit from this teaching. Together, we can build a community that respects and cares for its inner peace. Chapter 5: Daily Practices for Non-Negotiable Happiness. To make our happiness truly non-negotiable, we need to establish daily practices that nurture our inner peace and strengthen our resilience. In Buddhism, happiness isn't seen as a fleeting state, but as the result of a mind in balance and at peace. This is achieved through habits and routines we cultivate daily, focusing on what truly matters and letting go of what distracts or causes us suffering. The first step to establishing non-negotiable happiness is the practice of meditation. Meditation is a fundamental tool in Buddhism because it allows us to observe our mind, our thoughts, and emotions without judging or identifying with them. When we meditate, we develop the ability to witness our internal experiences, which helps us not to be swept away by worries or desires. A peaceful mind isn't one without thoughts, but one that knows how not to cling to them. Dedicating a few minutes each day to meditation is like watering the seed of happiness within us. Another essential practice is gratitude. Often, our worries and desires prevent us from seeing all the good things we already have in our lives. Practicing gratitude means taking a moment to recognize and appreciate the little things, from simply being alive to moments of connection with others. Buddhism teaches us that the constant desire for more is a source of suffering, while gratitude is a path to peace and contentment. You can start each day by taking a few minutes to write or reflect on 3 things you're grateful for. This habit transforms our perspective and reminds us that happiness is found in the present moment. The practice of mindfulness is also key to lasting happiness. Living in the present means truly being here, in the now, without worrying about the past or the future. Mindfulness allows us to savor each moment and appreciate life as it is. You can practice mindfulness during everyday activities like eating, walking, or even washing dishes. By being fully present, we realize we don't need anything else to be happy and that peace and joy are available in every instant. It's also important to dedicate time to nurturing positive relationships. Buddhism reminds us that we're all interconnected and that our actions and words affect those around us. Surround yourself with people who support you, who respect your peace, and who inspire you to be better. Healthy and mutually supportive relationships are a source of happiness and stability. On the other hand, it's equally important to let go of relationships that constantly undermine our peace and cause suffering. Remember, your happiness is non-negotiable, and you have the right to be around people who value and respect that peace. Another daily practice that strengthens our non-negotiable happiness is self-care. Often we become so focused on handling daily responsibilities that we forget to take care of our own well-being. In Buddhism, both the body and mind are seen as temples that we must respect and nurture. This involves being mindful of our physical and emotional needs, getting enough rest, eating properly, staying active, and allowing ourselves time to unwind. Taking care of ourselves isn't selfish. It's a way to appreciate the life we've been given. Lastly, detachment is a key practice for maintaining unshakable happiness. Detachment doesn't mean giving up the things we love or avoiding joy. It simply means not relying on them for our happiness. When we can enjoy something without becoming attached to it, we develop a deep and lasting peace. We can cherish a relationship, a career, or a possession, but we must always remember that our happiness doesn't come from them. This frees us from the worry and fear of losing what we have, allowing us to live with more freedom and fulfillment. Committing to daily practices for non-negotiable happiness is a promise to yourself. These small actions, done consistently, strengthen your inner peace and help you stay balanced no matter what's happening around you. These habits act as anchors, keeping you steady in tough times and reminding you that happiness is a daily choice, not a distant destination. If these practices have inspired you and you believe they can improve your life, subscribe to the channel to continue receiving content that nurtures your peace and happiness. Share in the comments the habits you follow to maintain your inner peace and help others by sharing this video. Together, we can create a community that supports one another on the journey to true and lasting happiness. Chapter 6. Inspiring Conclusion. Happiness as a Personal Commitment. We've come to the end of this journey of discovery, toward a happiness that is unwavering and an inner peace that isn't shaped by circumstances or others' opinions. We've explored profound Buddhist teachings that guide us in caring for our mind and heart, safeguarding what is most valuable, our peace and happiness. It's important to remember that happiness in this sense isn't something we achieve once and for all. It's a commitment, a path we walk each day. Every practice, every insight, and every boundary we set are steps that strengthen our inner peace and keep happiness at the center of our lives. Just as we take care of our bodies, we must also care for our minds and spirits, creating a life where our happiness isn't tied to external things, but to our deep connection with ourselves. Buddhism teaches us that true happiness comes when we stop searching for it outside and start nurturing it within. It's a happiness that doesn't need approval, isn't dependent on others, and isn't up for negotiation. It's a happiness that belongs to us, a peace that stays unshaken even when the world around us is full of challenges. I encourage you to keep exploring this path, to commit to yourself, and to remember each day that your happiness is both your responsibility and your right. You don't need anyone's permission to be happy. All you need is a sincere intention to live in peace with yourself and the world. If this video has resonated with you, bringing clarity or inspiration, subscribe to the channel so we can continue learning and growing together. Share in the comments how you make your happiness non-negotiable, and pass this message along to those who might benefit from it. Remember, we are a community that values peace and happiness, and together we can create a life filled with meaning and balance.